Well, we're going to go ahead and start the program. I know that a lot of you are still eating, and that's fine. Please continue. But we're going to go ahead and start the program so that we can get you all out of here in time to go back to whatever less interesting thing you have to do with the remainder of your day. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, and we're delighted that you could all join us today. Thank you so much for coming to our Hatton Sumners Distinguished Lecture Series with Noah Rothman. I'm excited to hear from Noah. I have learned in speaking with him at the table that in addition to his intellectual and authorial biography, he has also been a theater participant in college and a talk radio show producer. So he has had a breadth of experience in addition to writing fascinating books on important topics. As I said, we really appreciate having you all here today. I want to thank our underwriting foundation, the Hatton Sumners Foundation. In fact, I always have to read the full long title of the foundation just because I think it's so cool, you know. There are a number of foundations out there who give grants for various things, but listen to the name of the Hatton Sumners Foundation. It's the Hatton W. Sumners Foundation for the Study and Teaching of the Science of Self-Government. So they are a very narrowly focused foundation on something that is very, very important, and we very much appreciate their sponsorship of these events and their kindness toward IPI. One of the major things that the Sumners Foundation does is underwrite a number of scholarships for college students, undergraduate, and even some law school students. And we have a number of the Hatton Sumners scholars here today. Where are you folks? Raise your hand so everybody can see you. Very good. We appreciate very much having you here today. I know that this time of the academic year there's a lot going on. You probably don't need me to remind you of that, but we do appreciate you taking time away from your studies to be with us today. We also have a group here from Westlake Academy. Where's our Westlake Academy folks? Over there. Very good. Hi, thanks for being with us. Westlake Academy is a charter school, right? Very good. We're delighted to have you all here. Thanks for coming. And we're thankful for you all to be here as well. And I'm just flat excited that Noah Rothman is here with us today because it was not a sure thing yesterday. We spent much of yesterday on pins and needles related to weather-related delays and mechanical delays, and I think last count we bought 3 or 4 airline tickets from what I can remember just to get him here. So I'm delighted and relieved because you didn't want to hear me talking about social justice. So we're delighted that Noah could be here with us. I want to talk you through a little bit of sort of logistics for today. In a few minutes, Noah's going to come up and give his talk, and then we're going to do a moderated discussion and Q&A session. And moderating that session will be IPI's own Dr. Merrill Matthews. He's a resident scholar at the Institute for Policy Innovation. And then our special guest, Dr. Tiffany Jones-Miller, who is an associate professor of politics at the University of Dallas. Dr. Miller, we're delighted you could be here with us. And for you to participate in that session, you will need to find the 3x5 cards on your desks, on your tables, and you'll have to write out questions. And I will tell you that if you write out a simple question as opposed to a long paragraph, you have a greater chance of getting your question answered. So write neatly, write clearly, write short, make it very obvious, and that will enhance your opportunity to get your question answered. Immediately after our luncheon, we do a private session with Noah and with the Sumner scholars in a different room. So Noah will have to leave somewhat promptly after our luncheon today. So try not to get him too tied up. So your chance to talk to him is to write neatly and concisely on the 3x5 card and share that with us. If you're not at all familiar with the Institute for Policy Innovation, we're delighted that you could be here. We are a nonprofit public policy think tank. We work on a variety of public policy issues related to economic growth, individual liberty, rule of law, constitutional issues related to the founders' design for this country. And I would invite you to check out our work at IPI.org if you'd like to know more about us. There are BREs, business reply envelopes, also on your tables, and you can fill those out. You can give us your contact information, email address. We'll put you on our list. We'll make sure you're on the events list for future such events. So that's a good way for you to interact with us. And now let me tell you a little bit about Noah Rothman, in addition to the fact that he was a talk radio show producer. Noah is the associate editor of Commentary Magazine, a 75-odd-year-old conservative magazine with a wonderful podcast, by the way. If you're a podcast listener, and why aren't you? Because there's so much great content out there today. Commentary has a fabulous policy and political podcast that you should avail yourself of. So Noah is an associate editor of Commentary Magazine. He is a contributor at MSNBC, where he frequently shows up on Morning Joe and a number of other shows there. In fact, you've been involved in a couple of dust-ups on Morning Joe on occasion, which you can find on YouTube if you're looking for some entertainment. And most notably for today, Noah is the author of a new book called Unjust: Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. And we thought this was a critical topic for you all to hear more about. We wanted the students to hear more about it. We wanted our friends and folks in our circle at IPI to hear more about this important book, and it is available, as you might imagine, on Amazon.com and other outlets. So please avail yourself of that book. I want to read you one of the blurbs on the back of the book. I think that's really fabulous. It says, "Identity politics is corrupting the American ideal of a pluribus unum, out of many one, has been replaced by from one into many. In this robust endorsement of our nation's timeless founding principles, Noah Rothman says the things that need to be said, but that too few people have the courage to say." And that's one of the many reasons why we wanted to have Noah here with us today. So without any further ado, would you please give that New Yorker over there a warm Texas welcome. I'm very pleased to introduce Noah Rothman.
Oh, please. Now, you've primed the audience. I appreciate it. Affirmative action, one of the first experiments with affirmative action, was practiced in the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks inherited a vast Russian territory, multi-ethnic state. And one of the problems of governance wasn't just the fact that they had this vast territory, many of whom spoke a bunch of different languages, wrote different languages, and it was difficult to navigate that environment, but also because the Russian experience in these territories was oppressive. The Bolsheviks regarded how Russians governed these territories as chauvinistic, called it Russian chauvinism. And in order to address that, they erected some sort of structures that we would identify as affirmative action. They found individuals, local individuals who deserved to be lifted up, and put them in positions of authority. But they also had another element to that experiment. It was negative discrimination. Russians, ethnic Russians, were to be denied nationalism because they had misused it. They were to be denied positions of authority because they had abused their authority in the past. They were to be tamped down because they were due a comeuppance. As you can imagine, this was a terrible disaster. It had resulted in a kind of antagonism towards Russians. It resulted in a lot of antipathy towards the system by ethnic Russians. They didn't believe that they should be singled out for this kind of treatment. And the individuals, the apparatchiks who were lifted up into these positions, many of them were pretty incompetent. A lot of them were selected for their political connections and not for their competence as managers. And a lot of them were liquidated in the purges. The indigenization program didn't last very long. It resulted in its complete opposite when it was abandoned in favor of quote-unquote Russification. The entire experiment was ultimately reversed, and what happened is you created a system with the best of intentions by managers with an abiding faith in their own competence, who ended up making everything worse, and all in the name of karmic fairness. This was the pursuit of a kind of social justice that ultimately resulted in a complete disaster. What is social justice? How do we define it? Well, it's pretty difficult to define because it means so many things to so many different people. It has noble origins. It is a robust philosophy, and it is rooted in empirical ideas about fairness. And a lot of people who don't have a lot of experience with social justice advocates might think that this is just an unobjectionable idea, a very American idea. How to think about equality and fairness in a just society, righting genuine, real historical wrongs, and creating more equity and consciousness and general abiding faith in humanity. In the hands of its activist class, however, it has become the antithesis of the kind of blind, objective justice we seek in a courtroom. Its activists have embraced ideas that are in many ways antithetical to the American experiment. Notions like meritocracy is a myth, that individual agency is a lie, that you cannot rise above the station in life into which you were born. The accidents of your birth put you on a path in life that is in many ways predestined. That separatism is good, demographic, racial, or otherwise, explicitly because it prevents social discomfort. And that colorblindness in institutions is naive, at best, probably dangerous. Social justice advocates on the left might be surprised to learn that white supremacists believe all this stuff too. They're almost identical in philosophy. They speak different languages but use the same vocabulary. They are two sides of the same coin, and the distinctions between them are so blurred that the narcissism of small differences has them at one another's throats. The distinctions are so blurred to the point that I often decline to make them. So how do you define social justice? Well, the problem is you can't, because it has no definition, but also because it simply doesn't exist. Appending social onto the word justice doesn't make justice more just. It blurs the concept. There is only justice. What has become of social justice is that it has become a reflection of identity politics in a way that mirrors governance. Social justice is identity politics as an alternative theory of social organization, a way to organize societies that is fundamentally at odds with the egalitarian meritocratic ideals at the heart of the American founding. Unfortunately, this alternative theory of social organization is incompatible with the Constitution, and one or the other has to go. And I know which side I'm going to choose. So where does social justice come from? Well, it comes from the Catholic Church. In the 19th century, Jesuit philosophers in the Vatican were seeking a way to create an alternative theory of how to combat the secular Enlightenment in England and Scotland. The Catholic Church had a very different experience with the Enlightenment in France and a very justified antipathy towards it. And the Enlightenment in France was characterized by the French Revolution, in which churches were sacked, priests were killed, idols to self-worship were erected. The church was very right to be fearful of what men who were motivated by the cult of pure reason could reason themselves into. And so they created this alternate theory, which was hostile towards ideas like those espoused by Adam Smith. Charity should not be the result of individual self-interest. Charity should spring from something more noble than that. The notion that the invisible hand is the ultimate arbiter of events seems like an antagonistic notion towards the ideas of divinity. And so they created an alternative theory, and they called it social justice. But it was much more of a way to think about charity. Fast forward about a century to the late 1960s, early 1970s, and a philosopher named John Rawls put a few more pounds of meat on these bones. He advocated for a series of ways for us to think about social justice and to think about justice generally, to help us really understand what justice is outside of the context of criminal justice. Think about it like it's a finite commodity. This is the amount of justice that exists in the world. It's all there is. There is no supply chain. You only have so much of it. So you must dedicate yourself to creating institutions which are dedicated to distributing justice as equally as possible in order to have as much equity as possible, so that you are born into a particular station and you can have as much of a chance of achieving justice as anybody else. But how do you do that? You have to create institutions that are dedicated to distributing justice equitably. And in order to do that, he advocated for some sort of a thought experiment. So he created something he called the veil of ignorance. So the distributor, the enlightened distributor, operated behind this construct that would not allow them to satisfy their own biases, conscious or otherwise. So they don't have any idea who the objects of their distribution are. It's the only way to do this fairly. Modern social justice advocates have no interest in the veil of ignorance. The veil of ignorance is a morally obtuse concept. How can you have an equitable distribution of justice if you do not know who the objects of your distribution are? Who are the oppressed? Who are their oppressors? Who deserves to be lifted up? And who is due a comeuppance? Unfortunately, the criticisms of Rawls by men like Friedrich Hayek and Robert Nozick acknowledged that John Rawls too abandoned the veil of ignorance when it became an obstacle to achieving the kind of equitable justice that he envisioned. This was a feature of the ideas he was advocating, not a bug. If you are to create an equitable distribution of justice by seeing individuals not as individuals, but as members of a collective class, tribe, or whole, then you cannot operate behind a veil of ignorance, because that alone creates the conditions in which you are perpetuating the kind of prejudices and discrimination that you seek to address. Now, this is not to say that modern social justice advocates are consumed with life's big questions, right? Quite the opposite. The modern social justice advocate in the street, the really jazzed up activist class, they are not consumed with these kind of big philosophical questions. What they are consumed by are smaller things. They are frequently engaged in what you would most probably describe as culture wars. But what they are focused on, fixated by, is pop politics, or really pop culture. The targets of their activism are frequently people who already agree with them. Young adult novelists, artists, restaurateurs, and individuals who are more than likely to agree with the precepts of social justice, because when they transgress against a particular norm, you are more likely to get the person to agree with you to supplicate and to say, okay, you're right, and give you some sort of deference in order to demonstrate that you have some power and some efficacy. When, for example, you have somebody like, let's just pick one at random, Governor Ralph Northam, who was the target of a legitimate effort, by the way, to achieve social rectitude when he was caught engaging in blackface, which was, by the way, a transgression that he should have apologized for, and they wanted to take him out of his position. He said, if I were to resign tomorrow, I will be considered a racist for the rest of my life. So I'm not going to do it. And in the process, he waited the 72 hours out, and the movement went away. That is not an effective movement. And it's not a movement, by the way, that can project much efficacy by simply targeting people who disagree with it. So it focuses on smaller factions, individuals who are predisposed to agree, in order to project power. This is a movement that is, again, noble in essence, noble in concept, but flawed in execution. Among the concepts that this movement has embraced, among them being historical justice and rectitude in ways that are valuable, are concepts that are fundamentally at odds with the American experiment. Among them, colorblindness. In the wake of the Charlottesville attack by a racist demonstrator on peaceful demonstrators, a critical race studies fellow by the name of K. Sue Park, studies at UCLA, wrote a New York Times advertisement saying that the ACLU in particular has lost its way, in part because it's adhering to its mission that it's always had. That colorblind justice, colorblindness in institutions, has never provided real security or freedom for anybody. That's what she wrote. And in the days that followed, it turns out a whole lot of ACLU members agreed. A lot of them signed an open letter saying that our mission is fundamentally flawed. That if we are to protect the civil liberties of individuals who abuse those civil liberties, in particular, white nationalists, white supremacists, then we are failing in our mission statement, even though it is an abuse of the mission statement. Another idea that the social justice movement has embraced is the myth of meritocracy, to even suggest that there is the opportunity for meritocratic advancement in this country is to embrace an antagonistic notion that is at odds with the individual's experience, many of the individual's experiences. Notions like, quotes, this is the land of opportunity, and quote, everyone can succeed if they work hard enough. These ideas are considered not just flawed, but transgressive. They are considered microaggressions on college campuses. There are systems that have banned them in the context of academic thought. But perhaps the most pernicious notion that the social justice movement has embraced is the quote-unquote right to be believed. This is the notion that an individual who is an alleged sexual assault survivor is due not impartiality by the justice system, but deference because of an accident of birth. Wars have been fought to rid mankind of the shackles that perceive individuals to be subject to and beneficiaries of special treatment by the justice system by virtue of the conditions into which they were born. That is the condition that the social justice movement has embraced. And where does it manifest itself? Well, perhaps the most egregious example is the status quo that resulted after 2011 in the Dear Colleague letter. The Barack Obama administration and the Education Department sent guidelines to colleges and universities as to how to adjudicate claims of sexual assault on campus. They recommended keeping these claims out of courtrooms, where a violent case of sexual assault belongs, and adjudicating the claims instead in small chambers on campus by non-faculty administrators. The result, when these claims were adjudicated in a real courtroom, was often that accused and accuser alike had their constitutional rights abridged. Their First, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments were frequently violated in these star chambers. Millions of dollars were paid out to the individuals who were abused in these courtrooms. But this foundational notion behind these ideas were social justice notions. It's the idea that the American justice system is so shot through with misogyny that it simply defines sexual assault too narrowly, that the imposition on accusers that are in the Constitution are too traumatic, that somebody must confront their accuser in a courtroom or present evidentiary standards consistent with a violent criminal accusation are simply too onerous, too burdensome. That is the kind of idea that was at the foundational heart of this effort to reboot justice. But it wasn't more justice that was the result. It was more victims. Unfortunately, and I wish I couldn't say that this was the case, but the social justice movement, while mostly a creation of the left, is not exclusive to the left. The right has begun to embrace some of its elements as well, particularly the identitarian, divisive politics that Democrats and liberals have long known is a very potent and powerful way to form a coalition, but not an effective way to govern. In 2016, when Donald Trump was running for the presidency, he embraced a variety of ideas that are in many ways alien to conservatism itself. He told his followers and his supporters that you and your traits and your accidents of birth are not just looked down upon, but actively discriminated against. Male, Christian, working class, what have you. People in positions of power, ill-defined elites, are putting obstacles before you in your path to success. And your individual agency and your individual merit cannot overcome those circumstances. You must appeal to the mechanisms of the state to seek redress. Individuals, for example, are being abused by trade systems. The crafts in which you engage in are no longer of certain worth and value because individuals in elite positions of authority are abusing them, are taking that value for themselves. Your labor is no longer as much, doesn't have as much worth as it used to because of pernicious immigration systems, what have you. And because, like the left, which has embraced ideas like intersectionality, it has adopted a kind of notion. Well, you know what? I should get back to intersectionality. I forgot to address this. Intersectionality is one of the fundamental ideas of the left and the social justice movement on the left. And it is a very valuable idea. It is a thought experiment. It is a way in which we see how prejudice manifests itself in the real world. So you, as an individual, are born with certain traits. Some of them are more discriminated against than others. You might be a white male, for example, when you might experience less prejudice than a white female because women experience more prejudice than men. A black woman will experience more prejudice than a black man, and a Native American lesbian will experience a lot more prejudice than any of them, and so on. This is the idea of intersectionality. Again, a very valid academic concept. In practice, however, it has become an obstacle to achieving true authority and true power, and the best example of that is the Women's March. The Women's March was a very sympathetic organization. It appeared pretty organically sympathetic. In 2017, it was the antidote to the kind of violent outbursts that we saw following Inauguration Day. And these organizational members, its organizational structure wasn't readily visible, but it became readily visible when the organization began to become part of the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party wrapped its arms around this thing. And what you saw was an organization that was dedicated to intersectionality, and intersectionality tore itself apart. Its allies could not be seen as true allies because some of them possessed traits that were more discriminated against than others. And so those traits were inherently oppositional. So the Women's March's white Jewish members could not be seen as true allies because, in the words of organizer Tamika Mallory, they perpetuated white supremacy, whether they knew it or not. Similarly, the organization embraced people with no political constituency whatsoever. People like Assata Shakur, who's a convicted cop killer living in Cuba, or the Reverend Louis Farrakhan, Minister Louis Farrakhan, who's an overt anti-Semite. Abandoning these people would have cost this organization nothing. No political capital would have been spent. But if they abandoned them, they would have been legitimizing the prejudices against which they claim to fight. And so intersectionality prescribed this sort of thing. You can see how this philosophy might provide room for hucksters to operate. It creates the kind of conditions in which you're emotionally manipulable, malleable, subject to interpretation, subject to rather a kind of manipulation by unscrupulous actors. And into that void stepped woke brands. You've probably seen these brands operate. Gillette, the razor maker, recently got a whole lot of attention for itself that it hadn't had in a very long time when it came out with an ad that attacked the scourge of toxic masculinity. North American brand director for Gillette said, "We just really wanted to have a discussion around these issues." Well, of course you did, because there's no other reason to put a 2-minute web ad together that's never going to see the light of day on television. The whole point of this was earned media. Maybe the most famous example of this was Nike, when they hired former NFL quarterback Colin Kaepernick to be the face of their advertisements. Do you remember the slogan? Believe in something even if it means sacrificing everything. Nike didn't sacrifice anything. Sales went up 10%. Audi too. Audi had an advertisement at the Super Bowl that was kind of perpetuating the somewhat flawed notion that women make 77 cents for every dollar a man makes. Their sales went up too. Every poll that is taken around these issues show that people want to see their brands take stands on divisive social issues. They want to literally, at some point, wear their politics on their sleeve. And Republicans are just as subject to this too. Those polls show that Republicans are susceptible to this as well. And if anybody in here has ever brought a brand of coffee where the cover art has no grander purpose than to trigger the libs, you too are subject to woke capitalism. But the best example of this, the most pernicious example of this, is Fearless Girl. You remember Fearless Girl? This was a statue in Lower Manhattan. Young girl, school age, standing arms akimbo, directly across from the Wall Street Bull. This was feted by every Democratic politician in New York City as the height of social responsibility. Mayor Bill de Blasio said that men were very deeply offended by this attack on the patriarchy. It was hard to find a man who was offended by it, but he was sure they were. Elizabeth Warren made a pilgrimage down to Lower Manhattan, be photographed beside this thing, standing next to it, saying, "Fight like a girl." Gail Collins in the New York Times said it was the most effective attack on patriarchal structures that she had been privy to since the 1850s protests that desegregated New York City's trolleys. The statue was sponsored by a firm called State Street Global Advisors, investment firm. It was ostensibly designed to communicate to the financial services industry that we need more women in C-suite executive positions in finance. Great. Turns out, however, that we soon learned why this firm was so interested in this. A, they had a very small percentage of women who had ever occupied those positions in State Street. B, if you were to peruse their literature about investing, talking to women investors, you would see a lot of things that we would just commonly associate with stereotypes. You're supposed to speak in declarative sentences, use emotional logic when appealing to women investors. Don't ruminate too hard on these concepts. These are pernicious stereotypes, but they escaped the scrutiny that they were deserved because they paid deference, just perfunctory deference, to these ideas of social justice. And it wasn't long until we realized that this firm had a real vested interest in courting the social justice movement, because after a Department of Labor audit, they found out that the firm had been systematically discriminating against its female employees, paid about $5 million to 305 women. But because they said the right things, and because they approached the right topics in the right way, they evaded the kind of scrutiny that they deserved from people who are supposedly so attuned to these issues. Elizabeth Warren fell for a commercial for a bunch of Wall Street fat cats. But I don't think she's devoted the kind of scrutiny to the kind of pitfalls into which she fell. So back to the right and Donald Trump. And like the left, which failed to divorce itself properly and with vigor, owing to the urgency of the cause, to divorce themselves from Linda Sarsour and Tamika Mallory, Donald Trump failed with the appropriate vehemence to divorce himself from the white nationalists who were attracted to his campaign in 2016. And that gave them room to come out of the shadows, to say maybe our views aren't as marginal as we thought they were. And that's why you saw people like Curtis Yarvin, who goes by the name Mencius Moldbug, who's one of the Dark Enlightenment's chief architects, chief philosophers, establish a relationship with Steve Bannon in 2017 when he was in the White House as Donald Trump's chief strategist. The white nationalist movement that was attracted to Donald Trump's movement found that Donald Trump's movement was just as attracted to them. Now, in the days that followed, in the years that followed, we've seen Donald Trump begin to pull back and his movement begin to pull back from this pernicious idea, this identitarian idea that was just as attractive to anybody. It's a human idea. It knows no political bounds. But it is one that is definitely pernicious and dangerous. Conservatives have long known that this is an attractive notion, but that doesn't give us license to embrace identity politics because it appeals to a particular subset that they like to appeal to for political reasons, white Americans. Only the most cynical would knowingly adopt such a great hypocrisy for themselves, the notion that we can criticize identity politics and others while embracing a style of it for ourselves. So where does this all end? Well, I got good news and bad news. The good news is what social justice advocates want, a kind of aggressive downward social leveling, isn't going to happen. American institutions are not designed for it. So that's the good news. What happens to you, however, when you have erected these grand moral imperatives and American institutions are simply unresponsive to them? Well, two things. One, you can get very depressed. You can say, I'm just wallow in despondency, say my political activism is not worth it. It has not achieved what I want to achieve, so I'm getting out of the game. The other is to resolve to radicalize, to attack the foundations of these institutions because they are so immoral, so unresponsive that they cannot be allowed to stand. And that is, in my view, why we have seen so much more political violence in this decade than we've seen in a generation. Violence in the streets is back. And it is increasingly the product of identitarian factions on the right and the left, once again, at each other's throats. And it isn't just in Charlottesville. It's in places like Sacramento. It's in Wisconsin. It's in New York City. And it's been happening for years, and it's getting worse. Social justice advocates revel in a philosophy that is malleable, that is not rooted in any sort of doctrine that is compatible with the American experiment. It is based in faith, and it is antithetical to the American ideal. And when I say that in college campuses, when I say the American ideal, I get a hostile response. Because they say, the American ideal has failed. We have never achieved it. All they know of the American ideal is that we have never made it manifest. And that to me is a misunderstanding of what the word ideal is. By definition, it is aspirational. You may never achieve it. But that does not give you license to stop trying because we have not improved upon the concepts, fundamental concepts, egalitarianism, meritocracy, and English common law notions like the presumption of innocence. We have not made better notions of justice than those. Equality and the achievement of equality will be the result of lifting up and not of tamping down. Downward social pressures. That is what the social justice movement advocates, and that is why they will never be able to achieve it. Friedrich Hayek's comment on Rawlsian thought, his most salient, I thought, was that Rawlsian thought demands that in order to achieve justice, we must treat individuals unequally in institutions. And unfortunately, and I think he's right, that there is no reconciling Rawlsian thought with that criticism. It is a fundamental feature of that idea. And that's just why social justice will fail and must fail, because there is no justice in that. Thank you very much.